He did not look at her, not once. Not as she walked the length of the long gallery at Ashenmere Hall, her borrowed silk gown whispering over the ancient flagstones. Not as she stood beside him before the grim-faced bishop, a stranger in her own life, a ghost at her own wedding. And not as he slid the cold, heavy ring of the duchy onto her finger, his touch as impersonal as a physician's. Philippa Caldwell, who had been a governess a month prior, was now Her Grace, the Duchess of Thornfield. The title felt like a costume, and a poorly fitting one at that. The few dozen guests, assembled out of duty rather than warmth, were a gallery of exquisitely dressed statues. Their whispers were the rustle of dry leaves in a crypt. She had understood the terms of the transaction. Alaric, Duke of Thornfield, required a wife. A catastrophic investment made by his late father, coupled with his own prideful refusal to seek a wealthy bride from the grasping mercantile class, had left him in a quiet but perilous position. He needed an heir to secure the entail, and he needed a duchess who would make no demands upon his heart, his time, or his already strained coffers. Philippa Caldwell, the orphaned and penniless daughter of a brilliant but financially inept classical scholar, was eminently suitable. She was educated, presentable, and utterly alone in the world. She came with no troublesome family, no expectations of romance, and, most importantly, no dowry to negotiate. She was a neat, simple solution to a vexing ducal problem. During their single, chillingly formal interview in his London study, he had laid out the arrangement with the precision of a solicitor drawing up a deed of sale. "You will have the protection of my name and a comfortable home," he had stated, his grey eyes fixed on a point somewhere over her left shoulder. "You will want for nothing material. In return, you will provide an heir. Your duties will be confined to the nursery and the management of your personal household staff. You will not concern yourself with the running of the estates. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Your Grace," she had replied, her voice even. Her heart, a frantic bird in a cage of whalebone, was her own secret. What he saw was a plain, composed young woman in a mended dress, her hands folded calmly in her lap. He did not see the mind that had helped her father collate Greek manuscripts, nor the quiet competence that had kept their small, book-cluttered household from collapsing entirely for years. He saw a blank slate upon which he could inscribe his terms. Now, at the small, joyless wedding breakfast, she was seated at the far end of the impossibly long dining table from him. He was engaged in a low, intense conversation with his man of business, his brow furrowed. He had not addressed a single word to her since the ceremony. She was an object that had been successfully acquired. Her function would begin later, in the cold fastness of the ducal bedchamber. Until then, she was merely part of the tableau. It was then that she heard it, a fragment of conversation from the woman seated to her right, a beautiful, brittle creature named Lady Celeste Ingram, whom society had long assumed would be the next Duchess of Thornfield. Lady Celeste, speaking to her companion in a carrying whisper she made no effort to conceal, gestured vaguely down the table toward Philippa with a diamond-encrusted fan. "One must pity him, of course," she said, her voice dripping with a venomous sort of sympathy. "To be forced to such measures. But he required an heir and a settled nursery with absolute discretion. A governess is, I suppose, already trained for at least one of those duties, and she brings no inconvenient opinions." The companion murmured something inaudible. Lady Celeste laughed, a sound like ice splintering. "Oh, hardly a rival, my dear. She is a signature on a contract, a piece of necessary household furniture. Once she has done her duty, I imagine she will be just as easily forgotten." Philippa did not flinch. She did not turn her head. She took a small, deliberate sip of water from her crystal goblet, the cut glass cool and firm against her lips. She held the gaze of her own reflection in its multifaceted surface, a pale, serious face, dark, watchful eyes. She was not furniture. She was not a contract. She was a woman who had learned to survive in silence. A woman who had learned to build a life in the ruins of another's making. Her father had left her with very little coin, but he had given her an education that far surpassed that of any woman in this room. He had taught her to read not just books, but ledgers. He had taught her that power was not always a matter of titles and lands, but of knowledge, quietly acquired and patiently held. The Duke of Thornfield believed he had married a simple, compliant creature who would be confined to the nursery. He had no idea that he had just installed a master archivist in the heart of his crumbling estate. He thought her invisible. He would learn, in time, that the most significant forces are often the ones you cannot see. She lowered her glass to the table without a sound. The breakfast continued. The Duke did not look at her, and in the vast, echoing silence of her new life, Philippa Caldwell, Duchess of Thornfield, began to make her plans. The first month of her marriage was a study in profound and deliberate neglect. The Duke, having performed his legal and marital duties with a chilling, dispassionate efficiency on their wedding night, departed for London the following morning. He left no word of when he might return. The grand, cold rooms of Ashenmere Hall fell silent again, settling back into the genteel decay from which the wedding preparations had briefly roused them. The staff, accustomed to an absent master, regarded their new mistress with a cautious, watchful curiosity. They saw a quiet, plainly dressed woman who spoke little and asked for nothing. They expected tears or tantrums, or the nervous flurry of a bride desperate to assert her new authority. They received none of those things. Instead, Philippa began to walk. Every morning, after a solitary breakfast in a small parlour overlooking the mist-shrouded park, she would pull on a pair of sturdy boots and a plain woolen cloak and set out. She did not ride. She walked. She walked the perimeter of the home park, her gaze taking in the crumbling balustrades of the Italian garden and the choked, weed-filled expanse of what had once been a famous water garden. She walked to the home farm, noting the sagging roofs of the barns and the listless, underfed look of the cattle. She spoke to the tenants she encountered, not as a duchess making a condescending tour, but as a quiet observer, asking simple questions. She learned their names. She listened to their talk of poor drainage in the lower fields, of rents that had become impossible to pay since the grain prices fell, of fences that had needed mending for a decade. Her only companion in the house was her maid, a young woman from the village named Nan, whose plain, honest face was a relief amidst the grandeur. Nan was silent and efficient, but her eyes missed nothing. She saw how the Duchess spent her evenings not with novels or embroidery, but with the estate maps she had requested from the steward's office, spread across the vast, dusty table in the library. She saw the candles burning late as her mistress made neat, precise notes in a small, leather-bound ledger. The library became Philippa's sanctuary. It was the one room at Ashenmere that felt like a home. It was 2 stories high, lined from floor to ceiling with books that had not been touched in a generation. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and leather. It was a place of glorious, scholarly neglect. And it was here that Philippa began her true work.
The current Duke, and his father before him, had been men of action, not letters. They had viewed the library as a relic. They had no idea of the treasure it contained. Tucked away in a small, locked office behind a false bookshelf,
Philippa discovered the heart of the Thornfield estate: the archives. Generations of ledgers, deeds, rent rolls, and correspondence dating back to the 16th century. The estate steward, Mr. Fletcher, was an elderly, overwhelmed man who had served the Duke's father. He was a man of habit, not innovation, and the accounts he presented to the Duke each quarter were a model of rote transcription, not analysis. He was relieved when the new Duchess expressed a quiet interest in the historical documents, granting her the key to the office with a dismissive wave. He assumed she was looking for ancestral gossip or recipes for potpourri. Philippa locked the door behind her, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt a sense of purpose that was entirely her own. She began not with the current ledgers, but with those from a century ago, when the Thornfield estate was at the zenith of its power and influence. She worked methodically, her mind sharp and clear. She cross-referenced deeds with maps, rent rolls with letters from the stewards of the time. Her father had taught her this meticulous patience, this ability to see a story told not in prose, but in numbers and legal terminology. Slowly, a picture of catastrophic mismanagement began to emerge. The fourth Duke, Alaric's great-grandfather, had been a notorious gambler. To cover his debts, he had not merely mortgaged parcels of land, as was commonly believed. He had sold them off entirely, piece by piece, in a series of discreet transactions with up-and-coming industrialists and London bankers. He sold farms, quarries, entire villages. To conceal the extent of the disaster, he had then arranged to lease the lands back, creating the illusion that they still belonged to the estate. The rent from the remaining Thornfield properties was being used to pay the leases on land the family had once owned outright. It was a house of cards, a fiction maintained for 3 generations. The current Duke, her husband, was pouring what little profit the estate made into maintaining the illusion of its former grandeur. He was, she realized with a jolt of cold clarity, land poor. Not just strained, but fundamentally impoverished, trapped in a web of obligations woven by a long-dead ancestor. He was the master of Ashenmere Hall and its immediate parkland. But the vast tracts of land that bore his name on the county maps, the source of his perceived power, belonged to a dozen different anonymous entities represented by a firm of solicitors in London. Philippa closed the heavy leather ledger. The silence of the archive room was absolute. Lady Celeste had called her a piece of furniture, a signature on a contract. But a contract was something she understood. A contract had terms, obligations, and sometimes loopholes. Her own small inheritance, a modest sum left by a maternal aunt and guarded fiercely by her father, had always been her secret strength, the foundation of her independence. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. She had planned to live on its interest, a quiet, scholarly life in a small cottage somewhere. Now, a different path was opening before her. She began to write letters. Her correspondence was not as the Duchess of Thornfield, but as Mrs. P. Caldwell, a private individual of modest means, writing from a discreet address in a nearby town. Her first letter was to a Mr. Clement Holford, a young, ambitious solicitor in the county town of Shrewsbury, whose name she had noted for his sharp, incisive arguments in a local newspaper report on a property dispute. She requested his services in a matter of some delicacy. She was interested, she wrote, in making some small, private investments in land.
She had a particular interest in certain properties within the orbit of the Thornfield estate.
She enclosed a small retainer and a list of the first parcels of land she wished him to inquire about. She sealed the letter, her hand perfectly steady. The Duke had confined her to the nursery. He had no idea she was about to start rebuilding his foundations from the ground up, one deed at a time. Duke remained in months, The Duke remained to whom she was legally bound. A brief, cold note had arrived, informing her of his continued presence in town for the parliamentary session. He did not ask after her health or her occupation. The note was a courtesy, nothing more. Philippa felt a strange sense of relief at his absence. It gave her the space and freedom to work. Her life settled into a quiet, disciplined rhythm. Mornings were for walking the estate, speaking with tenants, and observing the practical realities of farming, drainage, and crop rotation. Afternoons were for the archives, for the slow, patient unraveling of the Thornfield financial tapestry. Evenings were for her correspondence with Mr. Holford. The young solicitor proved to be exactly the man she had hoped for. Discreet, intelligent, and deeply intrigued by the puzzle his mysterious new client, Mrs. Caldwell, had set before him. He was unburdened by deference to the local aristocracy. His clients were brewers, merchants, and self-made men who cared more for a sound investment than a lord's favor. He began to send her reports. The owners of the former Thornfield lands were, for the most part, distant. They were the grandchildren of the original buyers, investment consortiums, or banking houses in London, who viewed the properties merely as lines in a ledger. They were, Mr. Holford reported, often willing to sell, provided the price was right. Philippa directed him with a calm, strategic precision. She instructed him to begin with the smaller, outlying farms and coppices, properties whose sale would not attract immediate notice. She used her inheritance, leveraging it carefully. For each purchase, Mr. Holford would establish a separate holding company, obscuring the fact that a single buyer was consolidating the properties. It was a slow, painstaking process, like reassembling a shattered mosaic piece by piece. She began to know the land, not as a duchess surveying her domain, but as an owner studying her investment. She learned the soil quality of the upper pastures, the yield of the barley fields near Little Thornton, the value of the timber in Wren Court Wood. She read books on agricultural reform, on new methods of fertilization and animal husbandry. The knowledge settled in her, solid and real. It was a form of power entirely different from the borrowed, hollow power of her title. Her quiet authority began to be felt on the estate. She did not give orders. She made suggestions. She spoke to the head gardener about experimenting with crop rotation in the kitchen gardens to improve the yield. She discussed the possibility of using lime on the acidic soil of the East Meadow with the farm manager. She authorized the purchase of new slate for the leaking roof of the dairy. These were small things, but they were noticed. The staff, from Mrs. Finch, the formidable housekeeper, down to the youngest stable boy, began to see not a fragile, overlooked bride, but a woman of quiet substance. They began to bring their problems to her, not to the absent Duke or the ineffectual steward. Mrs. Finch, a woman who had served 3 generations of the family, and whose loyalty to the house was absolute, was the first to understand. One evening, she found Philippa in the library, asleep in a chair, her cheek resting on an open book about sheep farming. A half-dozen heavy estate ledgers were stacked neatly on the table beside her. A map of the county, marked with faint pencil annotations, was spread on the floor. Mrs. Finch gently draped a shawl over the Duchess's shoulders. She looked at the books, at the map, and at the serene, intelligent face of the young woman in the chair. For the first time in 30 years, the housekeeper felt a flicker of hope for Ashenmere Hall. This was not the Duchess they had expected, but perhaps she was the Duchess they so desperately needed. Philippa was never lonely. The work filled her days and her mind. She was building something, a silent, invisible fortress of competence and knowledge. Yet, in the quietest hours of the night, when the old house groaned and settled around her, she would sometimes feel a pang of a different, more personal ache. She would remember the cold touch of her husband's hand, the utter absence of warmth in his eyes. She had accepted the terms of their bargain, but she was still a woman. She wondered if he would ever return. She wondered if he would ever see her, the real her, the woman who was slowly, secretly, buying back his own history from beneath his feet. She did not know that her quiet, ordered world was about to be disrupted. A letter arrived, bearing the Duke's seal. He was returning to Ashenmere at the end of the week, and he was not coming alone. Alaric arrived with the autumn rains, a retinue of carriages churning the gravel of the main drive into a muddy soup. He brought with him a party of guests from London for a fortnight of shooting. Among them, resplendent in emerald green velvet, was Lady Celeste Ingram. Her presence was a clear, unspoken statement. The Duke might have married his governess, but he would continue to amuse himself with his own kind. Philippa greeted them in the great hall, a model of calm, ducal composure. She wore a simple gown of dove gray, its only adornment a small cameo at her throat that had belonged to her mother. Beside Lady Celeste's glittering finery, she looked like a Quaker at a carnival. The Duke acknowledged her with a curt nod. "Your Grace," he said, the title a barrier between them. He did not introduce her to his friends. He simply presumed her presence, a silent fixture of the house like the portraits of his ancestors staring down from the walls. For the next 2 weeks, Ashenmere was transformed. The silent corridors echoed with laughter and loud talk. The scent of wet wool, gunpowder, and expensive French perfume replaced the familiar smell of beeswax and old books. Philippa presided over the household with a quiet efficiency that went entirely unnoticed by the guests, who consumed the food, drank the wine, and dirtied the linens as if by magic. She sat at the head of her own table each evening, a silent observer. The conversation was a swirl of London gossip, political maneuvering, and cruel, witty anecdotes about people she did not know. The Duke was a different man in this company. He was charming, sardonic, and engaged. He directed most of his conversation to Lady Celeste, who sat at his right hand, her proprietary air as obvious as the diamonds at her throat. They shared a history, a language of sly glances and shared jokes that deliberately excluded everyone else. Philippa watched him, her expression unreadable. She saw the deep lines of fatigue around his eyes, the tension in his jaw that his easy laughter did not quite conceal. She saw a man performing a role, just as she was. One afternoon, seeking refuge, she went to the library. The house party avoided it, finding it too dim and quiet for their tastes. The room was her territory. She was surprised to find the Duke there alone, standing before the fire, a glass of brandy in his hand. He turned as she entered, his expression hardening slightly, as if she were an intruder. "I did not expect to find anyone here," she said, her voice even. "Nor I," he replied. "I thought you would be with the ladies, dissecting the latest fashions." The remark was laced with a faint, dismissive contempt. "I find I have little to contribute on that subject, Your Grace." She moved to a bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines, not looking at him. "Were you looking for a particular volume?" "No, merely a moment's peace." He took a swallow of brandy. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. He was the one who broke it. "Fletcher tells me you have taken an interest in the library." "It is a remarkable collection," she said simply. "It seems a shame for it to be neglected." "My father had no time for books, nor do I." He gestured vaguely at the shelves. Most of them are theological texts and dreary philosophy, hardly entertaining. There is also a first folio of Shakespeare, Philippa said, her voice very quiet. And a collection of botanical prints that is priceless. And the estate archives are the most complete I have ever seen. He turned to look at her then, a flicker of genuine surprise in his gray eyes. You have been in the archives? Mr. Fletcher was kind enough to grant me the key. I have been organizing them. The damp was beginning to affect the vellum. She offered the simple, practical explanation, editing out the long hours of intense study, the discovery of his family's ruin. He stared at her for a long moment. He saw a woman whose composure was a suit of armor. He had expected a governess, meek, perhaps a little frightened, easily managed. He had not expected this cool, self-possessed stranger who spoke of first folios and vellum. He found it unsettling. It did not fit the neat category into which he had placed her. See that you do not misplace anything, he said, his tone clipped. He turned back to the fire, a dismissal. He had noticed something, a crack in his perception of her, but his pride forced him to seal it over immediately. He did not want her to be interesting. He wanted her to be simple. The true test came a week later. A crisis erupted concerning the tenants of a village called Fenwick Underhill. The river had flooded, washing away a small but vital bridge and contaminating the wells. The villagers, already struggling, were now facing disease and isolation. Mr. Fletcher, the steward, dithered. He spoke of the enormous cost of a new bridge, the lack of funds, the need to consult the Duke's men of business in London. He proposed sending a few barrels of clean water as a temporary measure. The tenants, desperate, appealed directly to the Duchess. They found her not in a drawing room, but in the muddy lane of the village itself, her skirts damp, assessing the damage with her own eyes. She listened to them patiently. That evening, at dinner, she waited for a lull in the conversation and addressed her husband, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the chatter. Your Grace, she said, the bridge at Fenwick must be rebuilt at once, and a new well must be dug on higher ground. The table fell silent. All eyes turned to her. The Duke's face was a mask of cold fury. She had broken the terms of their agreement. She was concerning herself with the estate. That is a matter for my steward to manage, he said, his voice dangerously low. Mr. Fletcher proposes to do nothing for at least 6 months, Philippa replied, her gaze unwavering. By which time, the village will likely be ravaged by fever. The cost of a new oak bridge is significant, I grant you, but I have been studying the timber survey from last year. There are 3 mature oaks in the West Wood that are ready for felling. The estate sawyers can do the work. The cost will be a fraction of what Mr. Fletcher quoted. A stunned silence fell over the dining room. Lady Celeste let out a small, disbelieving laugh. The Duke's eyes were chips of ice. He was being contradicted, corrected on a matter of his own estate, at his own table, by the woman he had married for her silence. It was an intolerable public humiliation. You overstep your position, madam, he said, each word a frozen dart. I am aware of my position, Your Grace, Philippa said. She rose from her chair, her dignity absolute. My position is Duchess of Thornfield. The welfare of the people on these lands is my concern. If you will not see to it, then I will. She placed her napkin on the table and walked from the room, her back straight, leaving a tableau of shocked faces and the smoldering fury of her husband in her wake. That night she did not sleep. She waited for a summons, for a furious confrontation. It did not come. But the next morning, from her window, she saw the Duke riding in the direction of the West Wood with the head sawyer. The shooting party ended a few days later. The guests departed, leaving behind a wake of disorder and the lingering sense of relief in the household. The Duke did not return to London with them. He remained at Ashenmere, a tense, brooding presence in the vast house. He and Philippa existed in a state of armed truce, moving through the same rooms like ghosts, speaking only when absolutely necessary. He did not mention the bridge again, but the work began. Philippa saw the timber being hauled from the woods, and a small, quiet part of her registered it as a victory. She had forced his hand. She had shown him a sliver of who she was. But instead of bringing them closer, it had driven the wedge between them deeper. He avoided her, his pride wounded. He could not bring himself to acknowledge her competence, because to do so would be to admit his own failure. The winter that followed was harsh, both outside and within the walls of Ashenmere. The Duke threw himself into the management of the estate with a frantic, punishing energy, as if to prove her interference had been unnecessary. He spent his days in the saddle, riding the lands from dawn until dusk, and his nights locked in his study with Fletcher, going over the accounts. The more he looked, the more he saw the truth of their situation. The numbers did not lie. Rents were down, expenses were up. The estate was bleeding money, a slow, inexorable hemorrhage that no amount of frantic activity on his part seemed to staunch. He grew colder, more distant, the pressure carving new lines on his face. He saw the abyss opening before him, the potential loss of Ashenmere itself, the ultimate disgrace for a man whose entire identity was tied to his inheritance. Philippa watched him from a distance, her heart aching with a strange mixture of pity and frustration. She held the solution in her hands, in the deeds and contracts filed neatly away under Mr. Holford's name. The lands she now owned, the very heart of the old Thornfield holdings, were beginning to turn a modest profit under the improved management she had directed through her solicitor. She could save him. But she could not offer her help until he was ready to ask for it. And his pride was a fortress greater than Ashenmere itself. Her relationship with Mr. Holford, conducted entirely through letters and the occasional discreet meeting in Shrewsbury, had deepened into one of mutual respect. He was the only person in the world who knew the truth of her activities. He had come to admire Mrs. Caldwell immensely for her sharp mind, her strategic thinking, and her clear-sighted compassion for the tenants whose land she was acquiring. He treated her as an equal, a colleague. He once visited Ashenmere on a matter of local business, and the Duke, finding him in conversation with Philippa in the hall, had treated the solicitor with a freezing, aristocratic disdain. Alaric saw a provincial lawyer speaking with his wife, and felt an unfamiliar, possessive irritation. He did not understand the source of their rapport, the shared secret that bound them. He saw only a challenge to his authority, another sign of her inexplicable, independent life. The breaking point came in the spring. A letter arrived from the Duke's London bankers, the principal on a major loan, secured by his great-grandfather against lands the Duke still believed he controlled, was being called in. The bank was restructuring, and the loan, which had been rolled over for decades, was now due. The sum was staggering, far beyond anything the estate could produce. He was given 3 months to pay, or the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. Ruin was no longer a distant threat. It was an imminent reality. Alaric locked himself in his study for 2 days. He did not eat. He spoke to no one. Philippa could see the light burning under his door all through the night. On the 3rd day, he emerged, his face pale and haggard. He looked 10 years older. He summoned his horse and rode out, not to the fields, but to the neighboring estate of Lord Ashbury, the father of Lady Celeste. Pride had its limits. He was going, she knew, to ask for a loan, or perhaps something more. He was going to try and trade his title for salvation. He returned late that night, defeated. She saw him from her window as he dismounted in the stable yard, his shoulders slumped. Lord Ashbury had apparently been sympathetic, but ultimately unhelpful. Or perhaps his help came with a price Alaric was not yet willing to pay. A marriage contract with his daughter, Celeste, which would require the quiet, legal erasure of his current duchess. Philippa knew the time had come. She could wait no longer. She sent a note to his study, formally requesting a meeting at his earliest convenience on a matter of pressing financial importance. The request itself was an act of supreme audacity. She was, once again, breaking the primary rule of their marriage. She was concerning herself with the estate. She expected a furious refusal. Instead, a message returned with a footman an hour later. His Grace would see her in the library at 10 o'clock the following morning. He was a man with no other options left. He was ready to listen. She entered the library at precisely 10. The spring morning light streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Alaric was standing by the globe, his back to her, tracing the coast of some distant, unknown land with his finger. He looked as though he carried the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. He did not turn as she approached. "You requested a meeting," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I did. Thank you for agreeing to it, Your Grace." She had not come empty-handed. She carried a single, large leather ledger, which she placed on the great mahogany library table. It was her own private record, a meticulous accounting of every transaction, every purchase, every improvement she had made over the past year. She opened it to the first page. "I believe I can be of some assistance with the estate's current financial difficulties," she said, her voice calm and steady. He finally turned, a bitter, sardonic smile twisting his lips. "You? And how do you propose to do that? With the profits from the kitchen garden? With your pin money?" The insult was meant to wound, to put her back in her place. Philippa did not rise to the bait. She simply gestured to the open ledger. "I propose to do it with the profits from the Fenwick quarries, the rental income from the 5 farms in the Northern Valley, and the sale of timber from the lands bordering the Ashbury estate, all of which, among other properties, now belong to me." He stared at her as if she had suddenly started speaking in tongues. "What nonsense are you talking? Those lands have not belonged to my family for a century." "I know," she said quietly. "I have spent the last year purchasing them back." He walked slowly to the table, his eyes fixed on the ledger. He saw the neat columns of figures, the precise handwriting, the dates, the names of solicitors, the official seals on the appended documents she had laid beside it. He saw the name of the purchasing agent, a holding company represented by Mr. Clement Holford. And he saw the name of the sole proprietor of that company, Philippa Caldwell. Disbelief warred with a dawning, horrified comprehension on his face. He sank into a chair, his gaze still locked on the papers, as if they were a spell he could not break. "How?" he whispered. "With what money?" "My mother's family was in trade," she explained, her voice gentle, without a trace of triumph. "They were not grand, but they were prudent. My father invested a small inheritance for me long ago. I have been using it, and the profits from the first purchases, to acquire the rest." He looked up at her then, and for the first time, he truly saw her. He saw not the plain governess or the silent duchess, but a woman of formidable intelligence and will. He saw the strategist who had outmaneuvered his family's history of failure, and all he could feel was a profound, soul-crushing humiliation. His pride, the very bedrock of his identity, crumbled into dust. "You did this behind my back," he said, the accusation weak, hollow. "I did this because your back was turned," she countered softly. "You gave me no other choice. You forbade me from concerning myself with the estate. But the estate is my home. Its people are my people. I would not stand by and watch it die of pride." The word pride hung in the air between them, a perfect, damning indictment. He had built his entire life around it. His pride had demanded he marry a woman he could control. His pride had prevented him from seeing her clearly. His pride had led him to the very brink of ruin. And here she was, offering him salvation, not as a gift, but as a business proposition. "What are your terms?" he asked, his voice rough. He expected she would demand a lavish settlement, a separate life in London, a public acknowledgement of her power. He expected her to take her revenge. "My terms are these," Philippa said. She closed the ledger. "The lands will be returned to the Thornfield estate, their titles consolidated under your name. The loan from the bank will be paid in full from the combined profits. In return—" She paused, and her gaze met his, direct and unflinching. "In return, I will no longer be confined to the nursery. I will be your partner. In this house, on this estate, in this life. You will not shut me out. We will manage these lands together, as Duke and Duchess, as husband and wife." It was not a demand for power, but a plea for fellowship. She was not seeking to rule over him, but to stand beside him. She was offering him not just his legacy, but a future. All he had to do was surrender the one thing he had clung to most tightly, his wounded, solitary pride. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, the intelligence in her dark eyes. He thought of the cold transaction of their wedding day, of his deliberate cruelty, of his blindness. He thought of the betrayal in his past, a youthful infatuation with a woman who had valued his title above all else, a wound that had festered into a deep, abiding mistrust of all women. He had organized his life as a fortress against being hurt again, and in doing so, he had locked out the one person who had sought to save him, not for his title, but in spite of it. "Why?" he asked again, but this time the word was different. It was not a demand for an explanation, but a genuine, desperate question. "Why would you do all this? For a man who has shown you nothing but coldness? For a marriage that is a sham?" "Because it is my marriage," Philippa said, and for the first time, a tremor of emotion entered her voice. "And because I saw more than the coldness. I saw a man chained to a history he did not create, struggling to save a home he loved. I did not do it for the Duke of Thornfield. I did it for Ashenmere, and I did it for Alaric." The use of his given name, the first time she had ever uttered it, shattered the last of his defenses. The cold, proud Duke of Thornfield finally broke. He buried his face in his hands, and the sound that escaped him was a ragged, painful sob, the sound of a man who had been holding his breath for a lifetime. Philippa did not move. She simply stood, a silent witness, allowing him the dignity of his grief, the space for his surrender. The sunlight streamed into the library, and for the first time it felt not like an intrusion, but like a benediction. The rebuilding of the Thornfield estate began the next day. The rebuilding of the marriage began with it, a far more delicate and uncertain project. Alaric did not simply accept her terms. He embraced them. The first thing he did was to walk with her to the steward's office. He took the great iron master key to the estate room from a hook on the wall, the key that signified ultimate authority, and placed it in her hand. Mr. Fletcher watched, his mouth agape, as the Duke said, "From now on, the Duchess is to be consulted on all matters. Her signature is to be considered equal to my own." It was a public abdication of his sole power, and a public declaration of her partnership. The news spread through the household and the estate like wildfire. They began to work together, side by side, in the library that had once been her solitary refuge. He brought his deep ancestral knowledge of the land, and she brought her sharp analytical mind and her grasp of modern finance. He learned to listen. He learned to defer to her judgment on matters of investment and agricultural science. She, in turn, learned to value his intuitive understanding of the tenets and the seasons. They argued, they debated, they compromised. They spoke of crop yields and drainage tiles, of mortgage rates and timber prices, and slowly, through the neutral language of work, they began to learn the language of each other. He began to talk to her of other things. He told her of his lonely childhood in the vast, empty house, of his cold, demanding father. And one evening, as they sat before the fire, he finally told her of the betrayal that had shaped him. He had been deeply in love, or so he had thought, with a young woman from a neighboring county. Their families had approved. A match was to be made. But he had overheard her, speaking to her mother, laughing about how she would finally have the Thornfield diamonds, and how she would manage his difficult, melancholy temperament once they were wed. "He is a title and a fortune to be managed, nothing more," she had said. The words had frozen his heart. He broke the engagement and retreated into himself, vowing never again to be seen as a prize, a title to be won. He had chosen Philippa precisely because he believed she had no ambition, no guile, no expectations of the heart. He had chosen her for all the wrong reasons. "I was a fool," he said, staring into the flames. "I built a fortress to protect a wound, and I called it principle. I judged you without ever seeing you. I have been more unjust to you than to any other person on this earth." "We were both strangers, bound by a contract," Philippa said softly. "We each did what we had to do to survive it." She did not offer him easy absolution. She offered him understanding, which was a far greater gift. The change in him was profound. The cold, sardonic mask began to fall away, revealing a man who was quieter, more thoughtful, and capable of a surprising gentleness. He started to notice small things about her, the way she smiled when she saw the first snowdrops in the woods, her habit of tucking a stray curl behind her ear when she was deep in thought, the quiet humor that surfaced in her dry observations about their neighbors. He began to bring her gifts, not jewels or gowns, but things he knew she would value. A rare book on Roman Britain he had found in a dusty shop, a fossil he had discovered by the riverbank, a cutting from a particularly beautiful wild rose. He was courting his own wife. One afternoon he came into the library where she was working. He carried a small velvet-lined box. He did not speak, but simply opened it. Inside, nestled on the dark velvet, were the Thornfield diamonds, a river of cold, brilliant fire. They were magnificent, A queen's ransom. Philippa looked at them, then up at him. "They are yours," he said, his voice quiet. "By right." She reached out and gently closed the lid of the box. "No," she said. "They belong to the Duchess of Thornfield. That is a role I play. I would rather have a gift for Philippa." A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes and transformed him. "I see," he said. He took the box of jewels and set it aside. He reached into his coat and pulled out a single, perfect white rose from the garden. He handed it to her. "For Philippa," he said. She took the rose, its petals cool and soft against her fingers, and for the first time, she let him see the full, unshielded warmth in her eyes. It was in that small, quiet moment, over a single flower, that the contract truly ended, and the marriage began. The trust, so long absent, had finally taken root. 5 years later. The evening light of late summer slanted through the library windows, turning the dust motes to gold. The room was the same, yet entirely different. It was no longer a refuge, but a hub, the warm, beating heart of the house. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the scent of beeswax mingled with the faint, sweet smell of the roses blooming just outside the open windows. Ashenmere Hall was thriving. The fields were prosperous, the tenants secure, the house itself restored to a quiet, comfortable grandeur. The Thornfield estate was solvent, its future assured. Philippa sat in her favorite armchair by the fire, a book lying open but unread in her lap. She was watching her husband. Alaric was on the floor, down on his hands and knees, building an improbable tower of wooden blocks with their son, a sturdy, laughing 4-year-old with his father's gray eyes and his mother's serious brow. A daughter, not yet a year old, slept peacefully in a cradle by the hearth. The sound of the boy's delighted shriek as the tower finally tumbled down filled the room. Alaric looked up and caught her eye, his face alight with a love and contentment that made him seem a different man entirely from the cold stranger she had married. The harsh lines of pride and anxiety had been smoothed away, replaced by the easy confidence of a man who is at peace with himself and his world. He had found that his strength lay not in solitary command, but in partnership. He had learned that vulnerability was not a weakness, but a bridge. "He has your concentration," Alaric said, smiling at their son, who was already beginning to rebuild. "He will likely own half of Shropshire by the time he is 20. "And he has your stubbornness," Philippa replied, her own smile gentle. "So he will never admit it." Their banter was easy, familiar, woven from 1,000 shared days and nights. Theirs was not a marriage of grand passions and dramatic declarations, but something quieter, deeper, and more resilient. It was a love built on a foundation of mutual respect, forged in the cool fires of adversity, and tempered by patience. It was an earned love, and therefore all the more precious. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, they walked out onto the terrace. The stars were brilliant in the clear country sky. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, looking out over the darkened parkland, the land that was theirs, together. "Do you ever think of that day?" Alaric asked, his voice low. "Our wedding day?" "Sometimes," Philippa admitted. "I remember the woman I was, frightened but determined, so very alone." He turned to her, taking her hands in his. His touch was warm and firm. "You were never alone," he said, his voice filled with a quiet wonder that had never entirely left him. "You were simply waiting for me to open my eyes and see you."
You were the foundation, even when I thought I was standing on rock. You were always the true strength of this house. He drew her close, and she rested her head against his shoulder. The chill of that long-ago memory was gone, replaced by the steady, living warmth of the man beside her. She was not a signature on a contract. She was not a piece of household furniture. She was Philippa, Duchess of Thornfield, a woman who had quietly, patiently built her own happiness in a place where none had been offered, and in doing so, had saved them all. The night was peaceful, the house was secure, and in the heart of Shropshire, under a canopy of stars, she was finally, truly, home.